Welcome to The Wave. We are Voices of Ecology, a movement powered by the European Union Erasmus Plus program. WAVE brings youth voices to the forefront, from real-life interviews with youth in the eco-village movement to exploring degrowth and youth perspectives on intergenerational fairness. We're a multi-host podcast where each episode is unique and is hosted by a different WAVE participant. With a rotating format, a diversity of voices, perspectives and passions, WAVE brings them all to the mic. Join us as we dive into bold conversations, share inspiring stories, and explore how we can all live more sustainably.
Hello everyone and welcome to today's episode. My name is Estelle and I'm one of the WAVE ambassadors from Belgium. It is my pleasure to host this episode. Today we will dive into a fascinating discussion about Agrowth. What is it and what is not? What kind of society does Agrowth envision? Why is it gaining traction among economists, environmentalists, and policymakers? I am thrilled to be joined by a very special guest, Professor Jeroen van der Bergh. He is an ICREA professor at the Institute of Environmental Science and Technology at the Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona, and an honorary professor of environmental and resource economic at VU University Amsterdam. Through his research, he is committed to advancing the idea of agrowth and reshaping economic thinking to better address climate change and sustainability challenges. So, hello, Jeroen. Welcome to the podcast. Thank you for joining us today. It's great to have you here. And for listeners, whether you're curious to learn more about Agrowth or this is your first time encountering the term, we've got you covered. So let's get started. So, Professor, can you start by telling us a bit more about your background and how you first encountered Agrowth?
Yes. Well, when I was a PhD student, I was asked to join a team of economists to advise NGOs in the Netherlands on environmental issues. And the first question that came up was if we could clarify the debate on growth versus the environment. And this is almost 30 years ago. So since then, I've been interested in this issue. And I noted that in many debates, I was disagreeing with everybody. So people very strongly pro-growth got a response from me saying, well, I don't think it's necessary to be so strongly in favor of growth because that's not a guarantee for solving problems or improving well-being. And people who were strongly against growth went also a little bit too far in my perspective. It was almost dogmatic. I'm against growth. Growth is not needed. I said, well, it's not so dogmatic either. So I came up with a position that was more indifferent about growth, more neutral. My idea was we should ignore GDP, the unit of growth, the gross domestic product, and then automatically we would be indifferent about growth. And I used this idea in several debates and people would accept it, but then they would forget about it and they would again think you're either against or in favor of growth. So I gave it a name and that name was Agrowth. The A comes from being agnostic, deliberately agnostic, ignorant about growth, basically. And it's a response to the polarized opinions, in my view, the dogmatic opinions of always growth or never growth. I don't think either positions are very scientific or even politically wise. So I think I can defend the position of Agrowth from many different angles.
Okay, thank you very much. So now can you continue explaining a bit more what is Agrowth and how it differs from our current pro-growth economic model, as well as from movements like degrowth or beyond growth?
Yes. Well, so the Agrowth perspective is critical of both green growth, which is the nice version of pro-growth, let's say. If you put green, inclusive, sustainable before growth, it becomes more acceptable. But still, behind that is the idea that growth is important and we should always grow. And you also see that people who are in favor of growth, and they use the term green growth, if it's necessary, they will sacrifice green, but they will not sacrifice growth. Growth has a strong priority in our society. You can see that when growth is staggering, then the political system, the journalists in society, many organizations will become very negative. And that itself only reinforces the process that's behind the staggering of growth. So there is a self-fulfilling prophecy also, and that's also a dangerous issue. At the end of the day, being optimistic about growth or pessimistic is all about psychology and mass psychology. And also with the Agrowth perspective, I want to stabilize our society and our economy more against this positive feedback that if we think something will happen, then it happens, because everybody's responding to it. If everybody thinks we're moving into the direction of an economic crisis, then people are going to be careful in buying new products, in investing, and you get the self-fulfilling prophecy. What is feared will come true. And therefore, we should have less fear of low growth or no growth or negative growth. And that's the Agrowth perspective. We should be indifferent. That doesn't mean you are against growth, because if you're against growth, you don't want to have any growth at any moment. No, the Agrowth perspective says, let's ignore the GDP, the indicator of growth. And if you ignore something, automatically you become indifferent because you don't have information about it. So whether the GDP goes up or down or sideways, it doesn't matter. You cannot care because you decided to ignore it. And I think that then leads to a perspective that creates more space for our society and our political system to look for progress. Because now we only want to make decisions about all kinds of policies related to health, related to the environment, related to labor, work time reduction. We only want to do that if it's guaranteed that the economy will grow. But in my ideal world, that's not a good criterion. That's not a guarantee. The correlation between growth and well-being in our society has become quite low. In developing countries, it's different. In developing countries, I think there's still a high correlation between improving all kinds of basic conditions for people and having economic growth. But in the rich countries, that's absolutely not the case. What in the rich countries is more important, for instance, is making sure that there is equality. Now we're having more and more inequality because prices of housing, for instance, are skyrocketing in many countries, in many cities. So the problems are of a different nature than increasing the general income. It's more about distributional issues. We can also see that people are afraid to implement good climate policies because they fear that will hamper economic growth. Now, if you become indifferent about growth, according to the Agrowth perspective, it will be much easier to make decisions about equality, about climate protection, about work time reduction even. Work time reduction will maybe reduce economic growth because we all will work less, but it's very likely that people will become happier because of it. And so Agrowth at the end removes a constraint, and as a result of that, it will be easier, there will be less resistance to making good policy decisions in all kinds of areas.
Thank you very much. That was very clear. And we'll talk more in depth about several things you already mentioned, like the GDP, for example. But this brings me to the next question. So staying on this idea of growth, can you explain to our listeners how is economic growth usually defined in our current society? And in your view, is it still feasible, desirable, and why this idea of endless economic growth is problematic?
Yes. So economic growth, it points at the indicator which I mentioned already, the GDP, the gross domestic product, which is the sum of value added, what we in all kinds of economic activities, what we add through human activity, human invention, human creativity. So we add value to things. If we, for instance, take basic materials and we construct a laptop like I'm using now to communicate with you, then this laptop has more value than its ingredients. If I would take the laptop apart in all its basic materials, then the sum of the value of all those ingredients would not match the value of the laptop as it's sold in the market. And so we are adding value to products, and that's a useful concept. And the total value added in the economy can be seen as the GDP. Well, for a long time, it was quite logical to try to grow that because there was a high correlation with satisfying basic needs, with having sufficient money in the public sector to invest in all kinds of public activities like education, healthcare, infrastructure, and so on. But now we see that there's a decoupling. We see through many indicators, happiness indicators, corrected GDPs that try to correct for all the imperfections of GDP. We see that whereas the GDP keeps growing, these well-being indicators are not growing. We also see that inequality is not being solved, and that's a major problem in the rich societies. And inequality is getting larger at the moment, and the GDP doesn't reflect that, because the GDP may even show an increase, because people with a higher income see their income relatively much increase, and therefore they add a lot to the average income. The average income will positively respond to inequality sometimes. You could instead use a very simple indicator, which is the median income. That is where half of the people are. The famous economist and Nobel Prize winner Joseph Stiglitz has once said that we should replace the GDP per capita, the average GDP, by the median income, because it's a better indicator of where most of society is, and it also won't respond so quickly to all kinds of changes. It's a very stable indicator, and it's probably you could see it as a kind of a weighted average between an average income and the income distribution. So it captures something of the income distribution. Of course, it doesn't capture issues like sustainability or unsustainability, environmental problems, resource degradation. And so we need maybe an indicator that corrects for that. And in fact, people have proposed corrected GDPs. Famous one is the Index of Sustainable Economic Welfare, which was invented by Herman Daly. Another one is very closely related, is called the Genuine Progress Indicator, the GPI. And what these indicators do is they correct for all these imperfections of the GDP, inequality, environmental destruction, also the informal economy. Because the GDP only measures what we do in markets, informal markets where money is being exchanged. But if you help your friends or family, that doesn't end up in the GDP. Or when you do voluntary work, doesn't end up in the GDP. Or when you take care of young children and don't bring them to the official child care institution where you have to pay a lot of money, that is not ending up in GDP. Or when farmers produce their own food and they don't buy it or sell it in markets, self-sufficiency, that doesn't end up in the GDP. And of course, if you don't calculate all these things, then you don't have a good perspective on all the activities that people undertake and that contribute to human well-being. And therefore, a corrected GDP is a good indicator as an alternative to the GDP. And I'm a strong proponent of using that. And other people have also fought to get more support for it. And there's many calculations of it. And these indicators, these corrected GDPs, show that we're not increasing our well-being as much as the GDP increase suggests. So that's very interesting. Not sure if I answered all your questions. Your other question was, why can't we have endless growth? Now, I don't have a very strong opinion on it, because you have to be precise and recognize that GDP is a monetary indicator. Because we're calculating the monetary value in markets of our value added. And so, in principle, the value of money could grow even though the material inputs are limited. We can add more value by having more ingenious constructions of the materials. If we make smaller computers and more clever computers, and we're using AI now, who knows? The GDP might grow. I'm not putting my hand in the fire for it. I don't know. I'm not going to predict it's possible. But I can also see that AI is a completely new, innovative technology that could improve a lot of our productivities in all kinds of sectors. We all see it already. I have to tell you, for instance, if I wrote a paper and I had to correct it, for instance, the English and the language, I had to pay someone a lot of money, and it would take a week or 2 weeks. Now I send it to ChatGPT, and in 3 seconds for free, I get even a better feedback than in the old days. So this is amazing, and this is just one example. So it might be that AI is going to create a new wave of economic growth. I don't care, because I'm an Agrowth proponent, so I don't care. But I'm not saying that we are seeing the end of growth. At the same time, there are economists who have argued that the most important innovations in the past have been realized, and they pointed at innovations like the toilet. That's a very simple innovation. They said toilets and sewage systems have created much more hygiene in our society, and therefore we live longer. And since we live longer, we can study longer, and therefore we can be more educated and be more productive during our whole life. And it's true. If you live only 30 years, you cannot learn so much and not be so productive in your life. But if you live 80 years, you can study longer and be for a very long time productive. And if many people do that, of course, you have a much more productive society. So maybe the toilet has contributed more to economic growth than the computer so far. And therefore, you have to be careful to make strong statements. It's very complex. And people who have a very strong opinion, like, it's the end of growth and it's not possible. For me, they're not real scientists. In science, you have to be careful to make strong statements. There has to be a lot of evidence. And I don't have that evidence. So I'm very careful in making predictions about whether growth will stop or not and whether growth is feasible or not. And that fits also very well my Agrowth perspective, which is saying also, we don't even have to know. It's not important. Growth is not important.
Thank you. That's great. It was really insightful. And you actually already answered also our next questions were about the GDP and other metrics. And you also started to already give some insight about that. But we have a question on how does climate change revive or reshape this debate around growth?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that's very important for our times. And I think it does. First of all, you can see more debate about growth already now that we're talking about climate change. So the proof of the pudding is in the eating, and we see that it's happening. But it's also logical because climate solutions require policies that limit both maybe consumption and production to do the things that are very carbon intensive or energy intensive. And therefore, people feel, both business people and consumers feel, they will be restricted in their free choice. And hence, people fear that if we cannot make the best choices that we could before because we're restricted, then that will harm our productivity and our well-being. And so people feel like, that is going to limit growth. And I have to say also that people who stress it very much, like people in the degrowth community, take a risk also, because if you say for certain climate policies and climate solutions will limit growth, maybe you only create more resistance against those policies and solutions, because many people don't like that storyline. So I, with my Agrowth perspective, try to weaken that storyline or try to weaken people's worries. But I still don't think it's wise to go in that direction, to say we have to make a big sacrifice, because that's how many people will perceive it. Okay, if we have to limit growth for the sake of climate solutions, people will see that as a huge sacrifice. And you don't get political support for huge sacrifices. You get political support for win-win solutions, or for solutions that maybe do damage to GDP, but GDP is not important. And that's the Agrowth perspective, So I try to make people less sensitive to something that I feel might conflict with climate solutions, because I can see it might, but I wouldn't say for sure that we will limit growth through climate solutions. Because again, it's uncertain, and I'm also extremely hopeful that if we have good policies like carbon pricing, putting a price on every decision that uses a lot of carbon, that creates a lot of carbon emissions, I think then people will make different choices easily. I think we have a lot of opportunity to reduce our emissions. That's not the issue, but we have to stimulate people to do it. People won't do it voluntarily. Most people won't. And even people who say they do so in practice don't do it. And therefore, the issue is especially to get people vote for the right policies. I personally don't believe that we have to trigger voluntary behavior. There's no evidence that it works. In fact, we are in problems. There is a lot of climate change because of voluntary action. The voluntary action goes in the direction of status consumption, travel a lot, holidays far away, and using a lot of energy. Anything we do in life that's nice uses a lot of energy. Driving with your car, going skiing, going to a restaurant even. There's a lot of electricity use in cooking and luxury food and transport of the food. And don't underestimate that all the things that humans like, they have a big footprint. So don't expect people to sacrifice. Of course, people do little things. People will recycle a little bit. They will reduce maybe some little things, but the big choices, they don't alter. Everybody wants a nice house. Everybody wants a car in our society. Few people don't want a car. Even in my world, people who are climate scientists, who are very conscious, they live a normal life. They have a family. they have a car, they have a house, they also travel privately by plane. And so I'm pessimistic about voluntarily changing behavior. You have to change behavior through voting behavior. And we can only do that by not presenting climate solutions as a big sacrifice. And that's what degrowth does. And that's one reason why I don't think degrowth is the right storyline. I think it's the wrong storyline, honestly.
Yes, completely. That was really interesting. And behaviors, that's a big and complex subject. We don't have time to talk more about this now, but that's also a very interesting subject. So now I'd like to move to our focus on next topic.
Can I say one more thing about
course.
this? Because your question was the end of growth. And so I have to say also that growth rates have been falling. And people don't like that in our society. So, for instance, my parents in the 50s saw their salaries increase in the Netherlands. So Western Europe saw their salaries increase with 15% per year. And the same happened in China 10 years ago. But now the situation is completely different. For a long time, we converged to, let's say, 2% growth. And the European Union still has the goal of 3% growth in the Maastricht Treaty. But we don't make that. Spain is making it because Spain is a laggard. Spain had, during a long time, a lower growth rate and it's keeping it. Yeah. And what is the reason that countries grow faster than others? It usually has to do with the fact that they don't have all the modern technologies yet, or all the modern activities and sectors. And the other is that the people are not highly educated yet, or there is not a good distribution of education and job expertise. But now in most rich countries, everybody is highly educated and we have all the technologies that are available. So then it is extremely difficult to grow further. We've exploited all our opportunities. The countries that are now growing fast are countries that are improving the technology and the education of their populations. And it seems that in our society, both in the political system and society widely, people cannot accept that it's logical that your growth rate over time will go down because you've exploited all the easy ways to improve your growth and your productivity. Because at the end of the day, growth goes back and is based on the productivity of labor. It's all about productivity of labor. If you work twice as efficient, your income will go up. You will produce twice as much in the same time. So you could earn basically twice as much. Maybe the owner of your company will earn more, so it won't go all to you. That's what usually happens. That's a simple calculation behind it. And what you see is that China, for instance, had very high growth rates, but no longer. I don't know what the growth rate of China is now, 4% maybe per year, 5%. It's much lower than 10, 15% a decade or 2 decades ago. Because China's population is also more educated nowadays. And so this suggests that growth is going down. And that may solve to some extent also the problem that we may want to limit growth for the environment, or some people might want to do that. And at the same time, we see that growth is limited automatically already because there's diminishing returns to scale and to education and to technology. So maybe the problem will solve itself to some extent automatically a little. Not entirely, I think, but many people don't like that. Many people want that we have high growth rates always. And that's also one reason why I'm critical of the growth paradigm. If you always focus on growth, you will be disappointed because the growth will not be as high as you hoped. So you create also a lot of expectations and you are going to be negative. Oh, growth is not so high. And that creates then this negative cycle that sometimes leads also the economy to move into the direction of crisis. If you had hoped for more and it doesn't arrive, then everybody's negative and you get the feedback that leads to this self-fulfilling prophecy. So I'm not only critical of degrowth as a strategy, but I'm also critical of pro-growth as a strategy for these reasons. You see? Sorry, I wanted to explain this also.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you
Thanks.
for this addition. That was really, really insightful. And so now I'd like to talk a bit more concretely about the vision of Agrowth. So how would an Agrowth vision transform sectors such as energy, transport, digital technologies? And would this imply moving towards a society where common goods are shared?
That's an interesting question. It suggests a little bit that Agrowth is in the direction of degrowth. Degrowth is more like an ideology with a plan. And it sometimes has been called also communism in disguise, because they want to plan everything and they have an ideal society. And I think it's risky. I mean, our experiences with communist regimes have not been particularly good, you know. That has to do, on one hand, because the economy is extremely complex. It's the most complex system that's there. I mean, it consists of so many people with different brains and unpredictable behavior. And then there's so many technologies. And that's also why economics is such a difficult science. We have macroeconomics, which tries to explain the whole system, and the macroeconomy, the national economy. And macroeconomics doesn't have a very good reputation because there are so many different opinions there. And that's simply because there is room for subjectivity, because you cannot prove anything. You cannot experiment. The data are always very limited. If you have data, you don't know why the data are like they are, because there's so many factors behind it. And if you compare two countries, there are so many differences between the countries that you don't know what causes the differences. So economics, and especially macroeconomics, is extremely difficult. And that's why macroeconomics is, at the end, politics. All the macroeconomists that appear a lot on television or in popular talk shows, they are basically politicians. They can talk well, they're clever people, but they just talk about their opinion. And usually that opinion was not even self-made. They usually grew up in a department where a certain school and a certain theory dominated, and that's what they did the rest of their life. So, we're talking about a system that is very complicated, and I think we should be careful to plan that. And because for that reason, communist planning went wrong. It all started probably with good ideals and good intentions, but it all went wrong. And as a result, it also led to limiting freedoms of people, because, of course, if people had other opinions that didn't fit very well in that system where you should plan everything centrally. And so, for me, degrowth goes a little bit in the direction. And Agrowth is different. Agrowth doesn't have a plan. It doesn't even have a plan in terms of which policies should be implemented. If I would talk about it, I would only express my personal opinion, which is not necessarily linked to Agrowth. But what Agrowth does is remove as much as possible barriers against good policies. So it tries to create a context in which we can make the best decisions regarding policies. And so if then, for instance, we have policies like carbon pricing, then the economy will develop within the constraints of carbon pricing, and then clean sectors will be selected and dirty sectors will be discouraged. And more interesting, since carbon pricing captures the whole system, it also will limit indirect emissions. This is an important issue for me, because a lot of the climate policy is always concerned with direct emissions. So, for instance, many people are in favor of technological solutions like standards for cars. That's nice, but all the standards that we have for cars have to do with how fuel efficient they are, which means they look at fuel use and carbon emissions in the user phase. But what's also important is how many carbon emissions were created in the production of cars. And nobody knows. We know, for instance, that electric vehicles and hybrid cars, they probably emit more in production. So they're not cleaner in overall. And so we should know more about it. And I think only a carbon price can signal that. So I'm strongly in favor of a carbon price, but that's not an Agrowth perspective. But what the carbon price will do is create conditions so that the economic development will go in the direction, and as fast as possible, a direction that will be low carbon. And that's the best I think we can offer. I don't want to plan because the economy is too complex. Some people from the degrowth community, for instance, they say we should forbid sectors that are dirty. Yeah, but what sectors are dirty? I mean, of course, all energy production is quite dirty still. Metal production, plastics production, even wood production and paper production. But if we forbid those sectors, we have nothing. Then we really can go back to self-sufficiency, because then there's nothing. So really, is that the solution? Then they will say, no, but not all metal, but some metal we need. Okay, so they are going to decide. And then we get already in the planning mode. I don't trust it. Are they going to plan the economy? I don't trust it a bit. So that whole idea of degrowth is too much oriented towards we know what are the dirty sectors and we know what are the clean sectors. I don't buy that. all sectors are dirty to some extent. There is almost no clean sector. For instance, some people would say services are clean, but it's also not true. Computer services, for instance, are not clean. You can send an email and feel that's not a dirty thing. Well, email creates CO2 emissions. And if you have an email with a big attachment, more. If you ask ChatGPT a difficult question, more CO2 emissions. And so, but we don't know how many CO2 emissions. And would you forbid those things? Well, it would be difficult. I think the only way to do it is put a price on it and make sure that people are directed away from the high carbon choices. So, for instance, if people buy a glass, a simple thing like a glass, if you go to the shop, there are many alternative glasses, different brands. You don't know which one is more pollutive in the production. Which one should you buy? Well, if there would be a carbon price on all emissions, then the production of glasses that would use a lot of carbon emissions would become more expensive. You wouldn't have to think. Most people like to buy the cheapest product for the same quality. That behavior, I think, is good to assume. Most people try to find cheap deals. We don't want to pay more than what is necessary. We always compare prices for the same function service. Well, that kind of behavior will select for the low carbon alternatives if we price carbon. And I don't think we are going to change that behavior into altruistic behavior that people are going to choose the expensive alternatives. It's not going to happen. So I accept that people buy cheap things. I do that often too. It's normal, also within limits of your budget. Let's use that, and carbon pricing matches that perfectly. So I wouldn't say Agrowth is equal to carbon pricing, but I could imagine that under an Agrowth regime, carbon pricing would prosper, and then we would have a development of the economy that would go in the direction of low carbon.
Thank you for sharing your thought on that. That was a very interesting perspective.
Just one thing, you also had a question about sharing, common property and sharing. I would say the same thing. In principle, it's good to share things because it's true. If you look in all the houses of people, you see that everybody bought the same machine for the garden and the same machine that they use once or twice per year or even less. And it's a pity. And of course, commercial companies try to sell you products that you hardly need. You could also borrow it from your neighbor or share. So I would absolutely be in favor. Shared car systems exist already. When I was younger, I used it also. And I think that's very, very good. So it would be fine if the government would try to promote that more. But I don't think it's necessarily something of Agrowth. It's true that in the degrowth community, they talk a lot about sharing also. They're very positive about it. But it's difficult to promote because, again, it has to be made attractive for people, you know? And the problem is, of course, also that if people are rich, and most of us are rich, it's easy to buy all these machineries because they're not extremely expensive. You can afford 100 euros for some machine for your garden or for your house. And people feel like, oh, it's nice to have it. I'm flexible. I'm free. It's my freedom, you know. So it will be difficult to stimulate this sharing, I think. So my fear is that sharing will remain small. And it is still small. If you compare all the sharing activity in the total economic activity, then it's a quite small percentage. So I would be in favor of promoting it, but I must honestly say I don't have a good idea how to do it because it goes a little bit against this individualization and freedom and having enough money that characterizes our modern society.
This was part 1 of 2 episodes. Stay tuned and subscribe so that you don't miss out on part 2.